So with all that being said, I actually read a quote from psychologist Carl Jung that I want to start out with tonight. Here's what he said. He said, humans produce in art the inner images that the soul needs in order to see itself and allow transformation. And if I was to put that in my own words, I'd say we need images, maybe art, to help us process and understand the transformation that's taking place around us and within us, because it's difficult to articulate it in words. That's why I love this book that we're looking at, because there's an artistic image for each day of the week. And so it's really interesting that looking back over the last 2,000 years, that Mary is one of the most commonly featured people in works of art. So thinking back to that quote and thinking about what art means, what does that have to say about what we have to learn from Mary? Her story comes through in many of the readings that we read this week. But even if you weren't able to read it, I think her story is probably familiar enough culturally that we can talk about it a little bit tonight. I want to read you one of the verses that the author attached to this reading about Mary. It was actually in the very first chapter. This is actually a favorite passage of mine because Mary responds in such a real way. Gabriel appeared to her and said, "Greetings, favored woman, the Lord is with you." Confused and disturbed, Mary tried to think of what the angel could mean. I have felt confused and disturbed many times, and glad someone like Mary does too. So I thought we could start tonight, since art is such an important part of this book. And in our conversations, we talk about hope art quite a bit lately here at Hope Fellowship. I thought I would share one of the pieces of art from the book. And again, even if you haven't read it, you can still kind of take a look at this here on the screen. This was from chapter 3, and it's an image of Eve and Mary together. And there's quite a bit of symbolism in this, I guess it's a painting or whatever it is. So first thing I just want to ask is, what stands out to you about this picture? What are some symbols that you find meaning in? Basically, what do you see in this image that's before us? Anyone? I'm going to put my mic on mute and anyone can jump in.
Something that we are so lacking lately is the ability to hug, the ability to touch when we come into the presence of friends or family. There's a hesitation to touch.
What I initially thought and still don't understand is, what's that snake doing down there? This looks like a very positive drawing, painting, and it's got all the components that you would smile and say, "Oh, that's nice." But there's a snake down there. If anybody can figure out what that's for, I know the symbolism of it, but in the apple, but still I don't know why it's there.
I think when you look at the image, you could say that Mary's foot on the head of the snake is maybe is meaning how do I want to say this? Mary having her foot on the head of the snake is somehow saying to Eve, we are in this together. What you went through and what I'm going through means that we are in community as women, as human beings, and maybe let's let that old stuff go in a way. That maybe?
Yeah,
and
right.
The snake symbolizes the quote unquote bad, I guess, from the first story.
Yeah, the first thought that I had was just redemption, Mary redeeming Eve's story. Like, we put a huge cloud of disgrace and shame and making the wrong choice on Eve. She's almost portrayed as, the the bad girl. And Mary has such a loving, I mean, the look on her face, the touch, the gentle, stepping on the badness of Eve's past. She's redeeming her story. And I think she's showing a connection between the two of them that is much deeper and more beautiful than either one of their past failures or mistakes or choices. They're moving forward in something together.
Most statues and many images of Mary show the serpent beneath her feet, symbolizing that her love and intercession will prevent the destruction by the evil forces in the world.
Thanks, I didn't know that. When I saw it, I thought of, every time I look at it, I think of something different. It looks like there's a crown almost on Eve's head, and it made me think of the phrase we use a lot, to straighten your crown and remember whose child you are, encouraging Christian women. And then when I was thinking of that, I feel like it's how we go through life. We know we have the crown, we know we're a child of God, but yet as we walk, we have that snake wrapped around our foot every day also. It's kind of how I saw it.
Good thoughts, everyone, especially on the snake. I will confess, the first time I looked at this picture, I didn't even realize the snake was down there. But I tend to not see snakes if at all possible in my life. But I'm just curious, any before we move on, any other thoughts connected to this image that stand out to you?
I have one more. I think when you look at the faces, to me, it looks like Eve is looking down and has kind of a shameful look on her face, and Mary is her face is lifted slightly, and she's smiling like it's all good, Eve.
I wonder if I'm kind of looking at it and seeing family, like seeing Eve as the great grandmother of this baby that's coming into the world, and she looks like she's kind of blessing him and maybe sad because she knows what's going to happen to him, how much pain he's going to go through.
I also thought Eve had kind of that Mother Earth look to her. She kind of looks like she represents at least all womankind, but possibly all of humanity. I think she just has that, like the old grandmotherly, I'm everybody's grandmother look to her.
Great thoughts, everyone. Another thing that comes to my mind with the snake too, there's this in that story where Adam and Eve, which just have to say for starters, that story in Genesis of Adam and Eve, and they eat the fruit and they're not supposed to, is such a highly symbolic story. There's really, everything that happens is actually more about like the symbolism that we can kind of take from that. And it's a story that in my mind, lately I've been thinking about it a lot because it's so full of grace and mercy. Adam and Eve make some pretty significant mistakes, and God is still talking to them and searching for them, meeting them at their level. I was telling Kyla earlier, I was thinking about how how maybe the ancient people read that story and thought that childbirth was a curse, was a result of the bad choices that were made. And in Mary's story, we see God really kind of redeeming childbirth and saying, no, this isn't a curse. This is how I am entering into the world. This is how redemption is coming forward. And you know, the snake too, I think about in Genesis 3. I wish I don't have my actual print Bible near. It's easier to find things in that for me. But there's this moment in the conversation where God says to them, kind of the first foreshadowing of Jesus. It's kind of the first foreshadowing of Jesus in the Bible. And what God says is that the offspring of Eve will crush the head of the serpent. The serpent will bite his ankle, but he will crush the serpent's head. And that's happening in this picture. And it's kind of it's an image of redemption and healing and grace all happening kind of in the same picture. Thank you all for what you shared. You all, as always, brought out some insights that I don't think any of us could have thought of on our own. So thank you. So as we kind of move into the conversation aspect, I want to talk a little bit about the things we're going to talk about kind of come from chapters 1 and 4 tonight. And I was struck by what the author said about the moment when the angel comes to Mary. And the angel tells her about the role she's going to play in the birth of the promised one, the Messiah, the anointed one, that her people had waited for so long. The author talks about how many of us wish for some sort of heavenly revelation like Mary got. Either a revelation about what we're supposed to do next or about some kind of transformation that we so desperately desire. I'm sure we've all had moments where we thought it would just be great if an angel could show up and say, here's what you need to do, or here's what's going to happen. But I love the author points out that the thing about revelation and transformation is that it is change that we are not in charge of, and it is a hard gift to receive. The author of the book says that revelation doesn't transform the places you want it to transform. It transforms all the things you dreamed and planned for your best case scenario. I would say it shifts your perspective of what the good life looks like for you. And I think this is what for sure happens to Mary. Much of what takes place in what we call the Christmas story is not probably what Mary thought of the best case scenario for her life. Without even going into all the cultural things that it meant to have a child out of wedlock in that time, that most likely was not how Mary dreamed of her first child, how that would go. And this is why she is such an important figure in the whole story of Jesus. Because in many ways, Mary represents all of us. She's a common person, a common girl. She has no outstanding qualities beyond her humanity and her act of trust. The angel does call her favored one, but outside of that, there's no indication that she was like extra good, that she had even more Bible verses memorized than anyone else, or that like she never said a bad word or something. Like whatever you culturally might think of, she was a pretty normal person. And she is the only person in Jesus's story that is there at every significant moment. She's there at the announcement of Jesus's birth. She's there throughout several times in Jesus's ministry. She's there at Jesus's death, at his resurrection. And she's the only woman named in the room at Pentecost when the Holy Spirit comes. She is truly our gateway into the story of Jesus. I was reading a book by Richard Rohr this week, and he said something incidentally about Mary that I thought was interesting. He said, if Christ, Jesus, are the archetypes or images of what God is doing in the world, then Mary is the archetype or image of how to receive what God is doing and hand it to others. He said she is the image of what God is doing and how to hand it to others. And so when I look back at Mary's story, not just here, but throughout all of those stories of Jesus's life, the primary action verb I would say I see in Mary is the word trust. She trusts that God is up to something good, and that through her, even if it doesn't make complete sense in the moment, God is doing good things. And this trust allows her to become a part of a deeper story than she ever could have imagined. So I'm curious what you all think about Mary and about specifically Mary's trust. What have you learned about Mary's story this week as you've, or in your life? What do you think we can learn from Mary's trust?
You quoted Jung in the beginning, so I'm going to follow up with a Jung perspective on Mary. And according to the depth psychologist Jung, Mary is the female in all of us. But that we also have, and he refers to the archetype as the anima, which is the female side of the spirit of the soul. And that we also have a male called the animus, and that is the male side of the spirit and the soul. And that a healthy human being is one that balances the two, brings the two perspectives into balance. And then that leads to a third thing, which is what he referred to as the spiritual archetype. So I don't see the Mary story as historical. I see it more as a inner truth that has been expressed through allegory. And that when we reflect on it, we'll notice that many times we repress either the male side of us or the female side of us, and we are kind of lopsided. We are rejecting ourselves. We think that we don't establish that balance and so on. So there's a whole cascade of interactions with that idea.
Mary kind of sets the precedent for how I feel like we should live our lives as followers of Jesus. I think we've done at Hope Fellowship in the past. I know we've done this type of prayer with Fusion before, but we've often said, put your hands out facing upward to receive the blessing that God has for you, or receive the direction that God has for you, or the grace or the love, whatever it is. This is the receiving. And then hands down is your willingness to surrender to that direction, surrender to that plan, to share it with others. And to me, that is the picture of who Mary is. She says, let it be as you have said. I receive this purpose, this calling, this mission that you've given me, and then help me to do my best to live it out and to share that gift with others. So I don't think it gets much more simple than that in how we live our life, is help me to receive from God and then share it with others.
I've had a couple of aha moments this week. Just pray for something and unexpectedly you receive, but it's nothing like you expect it to happen. And it's this wonder that they touched on in the book. We don't have God's thoughts. We don't have God's mind. We cannot comprehend his plans for us. And yes, we pray. He wants the best for us, and we receive these things. But I was caught by surprise a couple of times this week that it's not how I thought it was going to happen. So it's an issue of faith and trust. And it's God's ways.
Also, I feel that I think we all do receive revelation. I don't think that we cannot receive a revelation or receive contact with spirits or angels, or I think we're more open and spiritual than saying we can't receive a revelation anymore. We may block it, but we definitely can receive it.
Yeah, it was actually something when I was reading the book, the author kind of makes it sound like those types of revelation are things that don't happen. When I'm talking to many of you on the screen here, we've shared stories of times that we've had some really unique and special encounters with God, where things are, for lack of a better word, revealed in some interesting ways. So yeah, I think that's. I think, John, I agree with you, and I think that's where trust comes in. Is being able to listen for God to reveal those things in our lives, and then trusting when we do. Any other thoughts about Mary or about trust? Well, the next topic I'd like to bring up is vulnerability. That's something that kind of was it was a whole chapter, but it kind of showed up in several different points throughout the book, and I think it's a pretty significant theme in the whole Christmas story in general. The author talks about at one point about how it's only once we get through, like in our conversations with people, you kind of have like a stable of stories that you share. He called them your trophy winning stories. The small talk that we always go through. And then it's only after you kind of get through that and get to the point where you're sharing from the realness of your life, the unvarnished parts of yourself, that true connection happens. In fact, his quote in the book was, "Any real connection involves vulnerability." I read that again. Any real connection involves vulnerability. So I'd like us to talk about that for a second. I first want to ask you if you think that's true. Does any real connection involve vulnerability? And I want to just ask you what you think about what that quote springs up in you. And let's talk about that from a human perspective in our human relationships, and then we'll kind of take it to another level in a moment. But in your human relationships, have you seen any truth to this statement? Any real connection involves vulnerability?
I think that's absolutely true, probably for most people, but definitely for me. Entering this whole dating world thing, if I'm going to have any real connection with anybody, I have to let go of the walls that I've built up over the years. And it puts you in a really vulnerable space to kind of put your hopes and dreams, to admit your shortcomings, but you have to have that out there in order to have that honest communication with anyone and that trust. And you can't trust somebody, which I think is kind of the foundation of a relationship, friendship or relationship, whichever. You can't trust somebody unless all that's out there. If you're holding something back from someone because you're nervous about what they're going to think or how they're going to react, or I think the vulnerability is really important, and it's a big part of that.
I think if the connection is on, excuse me, if the connection is equal on both partners or both people, the answer is yes. But there's a lot of connections that are not equal. And I think those may not have that vulnerability. that we talk about.
I think even just as a parent with my own children, they are able to receive something a lot better from me if I can share honestly about who I am and where I'm coming from. So this morning we had kind of a heart to heart with our kids about how hard 2020 has been on all of us. And we've fallen short on some of the best practices, the good habits of self-care and responsibility and things that we know are necessary for our best life. And we had to kind of share with them where we were struggling ourselves before they could embrace and talk about where they're struggling or admit that they have some things that they need to work on too. We couldn't just come to them and say, we see you guys having all of these problems and all these issues, and we need you to do something about it. It took a sharing to show them that we're real people. And I think even just when we share stories of our past, stories of our successes, of our failures, of our most embarrassing moments, it gives people a chance. It gives our children or those who we're trying to get to know a chance to see us as real people, to ask questions. You know, that's part of being vulnerable, is putting yourself out there to be known more, to be known in deeper ways, to be rejected sometimes. I mean, there's been relationships where I have put myself out there and for whatever reason, the person hasn't accepted me for who I am. And that, to be willing to be vulnerable, even when there's a risk of pain or of rejection, is hard. But I think if you can push through it and find that deeper connection with people, then you have that trust built up, and that trust grows. And I believe that trust grows over time as a relationship grows. So it does take a willingness to express the good, the bad, and the ugly, but it's worth it if it's in a relationship that you want to invest in.
I see that at your Ministry of Grace Kitchen. If you can put a little vulnerability out there yourself, it gives you a better opportunity to connect with others who have maybe different vulnerabilities. But until you expose yours, you don't open yourself to that connection.
I find two areas of vulnerability. One is in the social network, like getting along with other people. You know, how far do you deviate from the norms, from the social norms, by your attitude, by your clothing, by your appearance? You know, are you in sync with everybody? And then there's the area of your individuality. You rarely share that with other people. I find that there are very few people that you can sit down and really share something deeply internal about your existence, about what makes you, what gives you the fingerprint, voice print, and what Jung called the individuation. That's very difficult. So like a lot of my writings, I don't whip them out when I have guests over here, because I know I just enjoy getting that out, but I know that it's not something that I want everybody to read. And when I've mentioned that nobody has rushed over to find out what my individuality is, they kind of kept to their road, side of the road. So I guess when we come to the fork in the road, we should take it, as Yogi Berra said.
There's one thing that I've really learned a lot about this past almost year is the importance of being vulnerable, in that, like, if you've come across a friend and they say, how's your day, and you can just say, it's good. How are you? Or, depending on your relationship with that other person, it's really okay to say if you're having a hard day or something happened that you're confused about or trying to work through or something that upset you. Because I think that what we have discovered over these last several months is that we're all just superhuman, not like superhero human, but really, really human. And that we need to share that with each other, honestly, because that's how we stay healthy, I think, as we go through these difficult things.
I had that happen last night. I was talking to a girlfriend of mine. We were just communicating on Messenger, and she said, "What are you up to?" And I said, "Oh, just crying over my mother's recipes. It's Christmas." And it's just, she's been gone for 20 years, and I still cry over her recipes. It's just part of life.
Thank you all for what you shared. Some of you were very vulnerable. Thank you. So yeah, I think everything you all said about vulnerability was very, very real. And I think it speaks to the ways that we communicate with each other and the ways that we are a part of each other's lives. And the depth, the connection really happens when we're able to be vulnerable with each other. So the flip side of that coin, we've talked a lot over the last few weeks about what it means to be created in the image of God. What does it mean that God chooses to become vulnerable to connect with us? And that was one of the questions the book raised that I think is really interesting to talk about. And as I was thinking about over some of the stories of Jesus's life, it's really in those places of vulnerability that Jesus has some of his most powerful moments with people. We think about Nicodemus coming in the middle of the night with questions and doubts. Think about Zacchaeus, outcast from the world, hiding in a tree, trying to connect with Jesus. The centurion who's powerless to heal a person he cares about, the woman who touches Jesus's cloak in the middle of the street, the lepers that come to Jesus begging to be healed. Those are all moments of vulnerability. And that way, vulnerability is kind of the starting point, just as it is in our human relationships. It's the starting point in our relationship with God as well, or our connection with God. And I know everyone didn't get to read chapter 4 for various reasons, so I thought I'd read just this brief quote from the book. The author says, "So what does it say about God who's willing to be this vulnerable with us? Who's willing to come into the world through the statistical risk of childbirth? Who's willing to be attached by a placenta for nourishment and life? Who's willing to wait and grow in the human womb? Who's willing to be fearfully and wonderfully made just like we are?" Have you ever thought about God as being vulnerable with us before? If you have, have you ever thought about God being vulnerable before? Have you ever thought about God being vulnerable with us? And if you haven't, how do you think about that word vulnerable in its connection to God? And maybe specifically with the Christmas story here, God coming as a child, a baby, and all the risks and vulnerabilities that childbirth brings along with it. So some thoughts about vulnerability and our connection to God.
I think for me, it's a kind of a philosophical issue. Does God need us? And if God needs us, then if we abandon God, then I guess that would make him feel vulnerable. However, I don't know that God needs us. I get the feeling that maybe God needs us to fulfill his creation. And in that sense, I just don't have a feeling that God feels vulnerable. That's just my feeling.
I see it more along the lines of God's willing to take a risk, I guess. I like to think of it in that way. Not that he needs us or is weak without us or dependent on us, but I like the quote here. It says, both parties are taking the risk of creating something new together. And I really like, in thinking of the creation story and even thinking of what we've talked about, maybe the end of times when God restores creation back to his original intent, the idea of co-creating with God, partnership with God, being invited to be on that path with him. There's a little risk involved with that on God's part, I think, because we could reject it or we could mess it up or any number of things. But God knows that if he opens himself up to be known by us and we open ourselves up to be known by God, something really beautiful can be created there that wasn't there before. And I think that's where he's taking the risk for something really valuable.
I was kind of thinking along those lines as well, Kyla, that if you think of vulnerability almost as like you're giving up control. Like if I want to control what you think about me, then I'm going to, put on this facade and not be vulnerable. Whereas if I think I'm just going to put myself out there and you might like me and you might not, then I'm vulnerable. And I'm coming at it from that way. I think that like free will in itself is vulnerability from God to say, I'm not going to make you love me. I'm going to give you the free will to completely reject me if you want to, because I love you enough and I respect you enough to let you have that. And I don't know, along with what John was saying, I don't know if we can hurt God's feelings. I don't know. I don't know for sure if we can, but if God is sort of the epitome of love, and you think about a parent loving their kid, and it is unconditional at the same time that it hurts you when you see them make bad choices. So even to let themselves have free will to hurt themselves and each other, I guess might be a form of vulnerability from God.
I think we can hurt God. I think we can make him sad. It's called sin. And when we sin unknowingly or purposefully, and both can happen, I think God looks down and sheds a tear and is sad and would like that to never have happened or somehow get it fixed.
Here's another way to ask this question. What are some ways that you have encountered God in the midst of your own vulnerability? What are some ways that you have connected with God in some of your moments of weakness?
As I had mentioned before, that my experience, having an experience with God, so to speak, is when I crash. When I'm in hubris, or I'm feeling high, or when I am not thinking about God, or, especially when I was young, I didn't feel God. I thought I was God. And then the moment things crashed, money-wise, relationship-wise, friendship-wise, opportunity-wise. When I saw myself in a corner, then miracles started to happen. Things happened, and I could not explain them, why they happened that way. So I ascribed it to the abstract God. God help me. So that's the way I've experienced God. It has always happened and it's like the 12-step program. They recommend that you go to the bottom, and then at the bottom you'll recognize, you'll accomplish the 12th step. And that's the kind of the moment of desolation. When you feel like you're at the end of your rope. So there's something about that, which I have not been able to explain.
I always think it's interesting when you kind of reach the end of your rope for whatever reason, whatever situation, and you might not see it then, but when you look back later, you go, oh, wow, God really came in and changed this for me. And I don't necessarily see that in the moment all the time, but then I realize it later, and it's pretty cool.
I remember once back in the 80s, I had come from California, and I had left the teaching that I was involved in and all the friends I had and so on and so forth. And I found an apartment in Brooklyn Heights, and I rented this apartment, and things just started to fall. I had a wonderful job as a manager of a clinical laboratory, and then I lost the job. I don't know what happened, what decisions they made. The company was bought over by somebody else, and they didn't need my level of management. So here I was in my apartment in Brooklyn Heights, no car, no job, no insurance. And I was destitute, didn't know what to do. So my mother was living at the time in North Brunswick. She was living in a little apartment. So I called her and I said, you got room on the couch for me? And as old mothers do, she said, oh, sure, come on over. I have coffee and cake and all that stuff. So I came over and stayed there for a little bit. And it was wonderful for both of us, but I wanted to get a job. So every day I would take out her garbage, and there was a room where you would, she lived on like the 7th or 8th floor, and there was an incinerator where you threw the garbage down into the incinerator. And they had newspapers there on the floor that would be picked up by the recycling. And I looked at this newspaper and I said, oh, well, maybe I ought to look at the classifieds. So I grabbed the first newspaper I got, I went back into the apartment and I started reading the classifieds, and there was a job with a clinical laboratory. So I called him up and the guy hired me over the phone. So I was so happy. Like, see, I call that a miracle. Another person will call that a coincidence. But why would I'm throwing out garbage. There's loose newspapers over here. Most people are not looking at the newspaper. And this one has the right job. I was the right person at the right time for this one job. So that's an example of a crazy miracle.
I second that. It was a miracle.
This story is connected to mine. It's not my own personal story, but I can share it. My mom has shared her story with us, and I've shared it with you all before, and she's okay with that. But she was, I'm probably going to cry. We're all going to cry. She was an alcoholic while I was growing up, and especially in the early years of been in my marriage, it got really, really bad. And when Marga was just a baby, it was kind of at its worst, where we would have the same phone conversation over and over and over. And it's like she couldn't even remember that we had it. And it was just really painful. And I remember thinking, I don't even know my mom anymore. We don't have a relationship like I want. This is really hard. And I didn't know the depths to what she was going through. You know, I knew what I had seen growing up, and I knew bits and pieces, but I will never forget her vulnerability when she was able to tell us what she was going through, the demon that she was fighting against in her own life, and that she was able to be honest and real, and kind of like what Elizabeth was saying, just, this is who I am, take me as I am. I want to be on this journey, but it's going to be a journey. And that was so hard. And I can't even imagine how hard it was for her to be that vulnerable and to lay herself out and say, I'm sorry for all the pain that I've caused, and I want to do differently. But she did it. And gosh, I'm so thankful, because I look back at the story that her and my relationship has been on since, and I see so much healing and rebuilding of trust. And she is one of the deepest relationships that I have in my life right now. It's a beautiful story of redemption and healing in her own life that we have been able to share together. And that vulnerability is real and is difficult, but it leads to something so beautiful. And I just, as I read this book and as I think about those moments in life, I think sometimes the things that cause us the most pain and are the hardest to live through have the most beautiful story of redemption. This divine, it's a miracle, divine intervention that somehow can bring order out of chaos, healing out of brokenness, beauty out of ashes. And it's just an incredible story, but it takes being real.
Thank you for sharing that. You know, I was just looking at our time here. I want to give some space if anybody has any thoughts they'd like to share connected to any of this conversation, or this is kind of the point where I just ask if you have a thought or a question or something burning on your heart that's maybe not connected to any questions we asked, but you'd just like to share with the group or you'd like to talk about. This is the time to do it.
Thanks for sending out the link in the email. Got about halfway through the introduction. That's as far as I got today, but I appreciate you sending it and enjoyed what I read.
I just want to express, that when we came to Sparta, I was a bit dejected, being a big city guy, and but finding Hope Fellowship was a little miracle, and I really appreciate Ben and Kyla for providing this opportunity, and for all of you, even though sometimes I don't sound like it, but I truly feel that in my heart.
I just want to say that I've been loving the Barracklow House live stream this whole time. It's just been wonderful. Every time I look at the screen, Cora's bouncing up and down, and it just makes me happy. So thank you for letting us just watch your life while we're here.
Sorry for any distraction that may have caused. It's all influx all the time. Thanks for letting us patch it in.
A wonderful addition. You're very vulnerable. Y'all are very vulnerable.
That's what I was gonna say. It takes true vulnerability to just be as you are. This is how you are.
I appreciate seeing the littles. I've mentioned that before. And I think you're including them even though they're jumping around. And a lot of times people think their kids can't serve or do something for the Lord till they're grown up. But I think there's a lot of things they can do young too. And even though they're bouncing around, I think they're absorbing things too. And it's good for them.
Well, everyone, I really and truly appreciate all the things that were shared tonight. There's a lot of good things that were said, and a lot of very, very vulnerable, as we said, things that were mentioned. I think as we go through this book, I wonder if each week might kind of peel back a layer of what it means that God is with us. In Matthew's version of Jesus's birth, that's what the angel says to Joseph about what Jesus's name, about what Jesus's life is going to mean, that God is with us. And so as we talk about vulnerability tonight, I think it's pretty significant that God chooses to come to us through Jesus as a normal person, a person who experienced poverty, like real ancient times poverty, a person that, according to tradition, probably experienced the early death of Joseph, his earthly caretaker and father, experienced the betrayal of best friends, experienced hunger, experienced pain. Person who, had a conversation with a friend about this week. Person who from the cross said, God, why have you forsaken me? So God isn't just off in the distance. God isn't just at an arm's length. Many of the things that we feel and experience, many of the things that we, especially during the holiday season, maybe feel much more acutely. Jesus has been through those. And through Jesus, God knows what those things are like. And so when we say God is with us, it's almost kind of like we're saying God is on our side. Through Jesus, God shows us it's good to be human. God came to us in human form. And Jesus, as we go on, shows us how to be a new type of human that is able to grow into the people we were created to be. So tonight, maybe the deepest prayer in your heart is a prayer maybe that was mentioned like in the first chapter, God, I just need to change. And I think we all feel that in 2020 to some degree. Maybe the prayer of your heart is a very guttural prayer of disappointment and pain and loss and fear. And I think you can take comfort in knowing that God is with you in that. Like with you in the beside you, going through it with you, compassionate and merciful sense. So as we pray tonight, as we close in prayer, I'm going to give you some quiet space to talk to God about those things. Maybe some space for you to be vulnerable with God. I think sometimes those prayers are best when we can just be quiet and open our hearts, our true selves to God and listen. And then sometimes it's best when we are pretty real and honest with God in our prayers. So I'm just going to give us some space to do that. Sometimes it's good to have some space for quiet. So I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to give you all a chance to pray, and then we'll close. God, we thank you that you are with us in ways that we can't comprehend, in ways that we can. Thank you for the presence of Christ in each and every moment of our lives. God, as we go through this season, may we become awake and aware of all the ways Jesus is coming into this moment with us each and every day. May we look at others the way Jesus views them. May we speak with the mercy and grace of Jesus. And may we act with Jesus' loving hands. I ask for everyone on this screen that the Holy Spirit would be transformative in our lives, shaping us to be more like Christ, shaping us to be bright lights for your love in the world. But God, we also acknowledge sometimes it takes some real healing to get there. So we ask for that. We ask that each of us experiences you in a real and tangible way so that we can share the good news of what you're doing in our lives, what you're doing in the world around us, and give you the glory for it. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, my friends. So glad to have you all here tonight. I always look forward to these conversations on Sunday. I hope you continue to enjoy the book if you're choosing to read it. I hope if you don't have your book yet, I hope that it comes. And if it gets in the middle of the week and you don't get it, let me know and we'll work out something with like the Kindle download or something like that. But otherwise, so good to see you all. May you go into your week full of grace and peace, and we'll talk to you later. Have a good one.
Have a good week, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.